It's 3 a.m. You got up early because you got to go downstairs to the entrance of your apartment complex to meet up with your friend because you two are going to go fishing off the coast of Rhode Island. And yes, this is a true story that happened to me. So you get in your friend's car, you drive down to Rhode Island from Connecticut, and you get on this tiny little fishing boat, and you think to yourself, it's fine. I don't get seasick. I've ridden in boats before. Granted, none of them were this small, but, it'll be fine. And then you set out to sea. But then as the boat's rocking back and forth, even on this generally still water, a feeling starts creeping over you. Nausea. Intense nausea. And you start realizing, oh shit, this is seasickness. You've never experienced seasickness before, but now you're 20 miles off the coast of Rhode Island and there is no one around and nothing to do except fish and grit your teeth and bear the motion sickness. And so while you're sitting on the boat, fishing, trying to hold back vomiting from the seasickness, you start to think to yourself, well, what is seasickness and what is motion sickness? And how do those things work? What is the physiology behind that? Well, let's talk about that on today's episode of The Science Behind That.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists. Welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard in the intro, today we're going to be discussing the science behind motion sickness. We're going to be talking about what motion sickness is, the anatomy of the ear, and of course how motion sickness works and how that plays into the structure of the body's vestibular system, and of course what the vestibular system is. But before we do that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite all of you to go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we'll jump right in to today's episode. So today's episode is going to be a little bit shorter just because this is a much more straightforward concept. But now that you all are sat back and relaxed and with your cup of coffee, we'll jump right in. So what is motion sickness? Motion sickness is simply, it's two conflicting signals that are being received by the brain. So when the brain receives visual or auditory input that says one thing, and then the vestibular system gives it information that says another thing, that conflict can cause motion sickness. And what's an example of that? Well, if you're sitting in a car and you're looking out the window, your eyes are seeing movement, and so your eyes are sending to the brain a signal that you're moving. But your vestibular system, it doesn't sense any motion. And so it's not, so it's sending a signal to the brain that there is no motion. And all in all, that results in motion sickness with some people. Now, not everybody develops motion sickness, and it's important to note that there are varying degrees of motion sickness, and that people can become accustomed to motion sickness just like with anything. But as I'm sure many of you or all of you know, because I'm sure all of you have experienced motion sickness at some point, the symptoms are dizziness, fatigue, headache, irritability, nausea, vomiting, rapid breathing, hypersalivation, and sweating or cold sweats. And I'm sure everybody at some point has experienced motion sickness. And seasickness is very similar to motion sickness in that it has to do with the perception of movement by the vestibular system versus what you're actively perceiving. So now that we know what motion sickness is, let's jump into what the vestibular system is and the anatomy of the ear. So the vestibular system is a component of the ear, and the ear is made up of the external ear, the the internal part and the medial part, the middle ear, basically. The external ear is the auricle, and the auricle and the pinna, or the auricle or the pinna, and the external acoustic medius is basically what you visually see on a person. So the auricle or the pinna is the fleshy part of the ear that you see, and the external acoustic meatus is the ear canal. And that's the canal that goes from the outside of the ear into the side of the skull. And so then that leads into your middle ear, and your middle ear is composed of, it's referred to as the tympanic cavity, and it's the air-filled section of temporal bone, and it's composed of the bones of the middle ear, which connect with the tympanic membrane. And as sound comes in, the tympanic membrane vibrates, which travels down the bones of the inner ear, which are your stapes, your malleus, your incus, and your stapes. And that transduces the sound into the eustachian, or into the cochlea. And then your inner ear, and that's your vestibulocochlear organs, and those receive the transduced sound from the malleus, incus, and the stapes. And they receive these sound waves and convert them into electrical signals through interpretation by the brain, and they maintain balance and recognize the position of the body. So this is our vestibular system. And this membranous labyrinth is a series of ducts, and it contains endolymph, which is a fluid, and it's composed of your semicircular canals and your otolith organs. And your semicircular canals, they sense rotational movement. So this is the components of the vestibular system, and the endolymph fluid fills the semicircular canals, which have a swelling at the base, called an ampulla and a cupula. And then your utricle and your saccule contain hair cells, and these hair cells are attached to a membrane within the vestibular structure. And when the head moves, when it moves down, when it moves to the side, that membrane sags, and it pulls the hair cells down in the direction of which the head is sagging, and that facilitates directional sensation of the head. It senses linear acceleration and rotational movement of the head specifically. Semicircular canals, they also contain these hair cells, and they specifically sense rotational movements, so they're more for your body movements. And ultimately, that's it. Now, we could go into a lot more detail about the structure of the ear, but for the purposes of this episode, that's it. And so the vestibular system, then, it will send one signal to the brain that it will say, hey, I'm at rest, and then the eyes are sending another signal to the brain saying, hey, I'm not at rest. That is what causes the motion sickness that many people feel. It's that conflicting sensation that the brain has difficulty dealing with or processing, and as a result, it can cause these symptoms in some people. The things that would trigger motion sickness would be your amusement park rides. Some people get very motion sick from VR, which I think is interesting, but it makes sense because VR is kind of the same thing as riding in a car, because you're motionless, you are staying still. But what you're visually seeing is you're visually seeing movement, and you're perceiving it as if you're moving. So that makes sense. And then, of course, riding in, airplane, boats, cars, car sickness, airplane sickness, and seasickness are all types of motion sickness. And they all operate on this same basic principle of your visual system generally is giving your brain a different input than your vestibular system is. Um, and it's that causes motion sickness. And ultimately, after a while, a lot of people can become accustomed to this. So people that start out as seasick, basically, after repeated exposure can become accustomed to that seasickness, or to the movement of the ocean. And so they don't get seasick as frequently anymore. I remember I used to work at a job that required me to go out on a boat every day, and I didn't really get seasick unless the ocean was really rough. And then I went on a tiny little fishing boat, and oh my God, I got so seasick. However, I was talking to the crew of that boat, and one of the crew members said that he was the same way, but after working on the boat for a while, you get used to it and you don't get seasick anymore. And that's simply because your brain becomes accustomed to receiving conflicting visual and vestibular inputs, and as such, adjusts to compensate for it. And the same thing can be applied to, if you're in a car and you get car sick, or if you're in a plane. And of course, the final part of this episode is just a brief, what helps with motion sickness. The big things that help with motion sickness are lying back, breathing out through your nose, through your mouth, breathing in and out through your mouth helps. Closing your eyes and not looking at the thing that's moving, that it goes the longest to helping with motion sickness, because again, motion sickness is from two conflicting inputs, your visual input and your vestibular system input. So if you don't look at it, basically, that helps to minimize the detrimental effects of motion sickness. So, ladies and gentlemen, overall, that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I know it was a little shorter than my usual episodes, and I hope that you walked away from this learning something new. Ultimately, we covered what motion sickness is. It's a conflict of data, basically, that your brain is receiving from your visual centers and your vestibular centers of the brain. We covered the anatomy of the ear. You have an external, middle, and internal portion of the ear. And the internal portion of the ear contains the vestibular system. We covered the vestibular system in the context of motion sickness. The semicircular canals and the otolith organs are the primary ones responsible for sensing the body's position in space and time. And of course, we talked about ways to minimize motion sickness and why it seems like after repeat exposure, a person can become used to motion sickness. So that's all I have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Science Behind That podcast. I'll see you all on Friday. And remember, as always, stand up and question everything.
Can't wait, a first time, a first date. You're so fine, I'm so late. You sip wine, I drink straight. Don't waste time to my place. I feel my heart erase. So catch me if I fall.